Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Super excited to hear from Jacinta about what she's working on.
And we'll just start off with an acknowledgement.
Thank you. Adelaide Sustainable Building Network acknowledges the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, Tarntanya, where our work is most often undertaken. We also acknowledge the Paramount people of the Mount Lofty Ranges, the Nirrangiri of the Fleurieu, Coorong and Lower Murray regions, and the Ngadjuri of the Barossa and Mid-North as the traditional custodians of the land where we live and work. We pay our respects to all elders past and present of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations.
Thanks, Ben. And so today we'll be hearing from Dr. Jacinta Humphrey, who is an urban ecologist and postdoctoral researcher with the iconic science group at RMIT University. Her work explores the application of biodiversity sensitive urban design and aims to guide the creation of multifunctional spaces where people and nature can thrive. She also monitors the Birrarung Trial Floating Wetlands, a series of artificial habitat islands installed in the Yarra River-Birrarung on behalf of the University of Melbourne. So thanks, awesome. Jacinta.
Thanks, guys. Lovely. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me along to speak at the Adelaide Sustainable Building Network this morning. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we're meeting today. I myself live and work on the unceded lands of the Birrarung and Wurundjeri peoples here in Melbourne. And I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their ongoing connection with country and the important role that they play in the management and conservation of our native biodiversity. As we've already heard, my name is Jacinta Humphrey, and today I'm going to be talking about how we can improve habitat for native birds in urban areas. So this is some of the research I conducted as part of my PhD here in Melbourne. So, as I'm sure we're all aware, cities can be really challenging places for wildlife to live in, and birds are no exception. In order to survive in our parks and our gardens, birds have to navigate a whole range of threats, including habitat clearing, anthropogenic noise, say from cars and traffic, urban heat, artificial light at night, which is an emerging threat for our wildlife, the risk of car strike and roads, predation by cats and foxes, all different kinds of pollution and litter, and of course, everyday disturbances from all of the people that live in our cities. So it's therefore not surprising to learn that some animals cope better with these challenges than others. And research has shown that many species of native birds are actually now disappearing from our suburbs and cities. The good news is local councils all across Australia are increasingly interested in trying to restore and enhance habitat for birds. And private residents, certainly here in Melbourne, and I imagine in many other cities, are really keen to participate in wildlife-friendly gardening programs. And this is all in an effort to try and attract some of these species back to our local parks and gardens. Now, some of you might be wondering, why does this matter? Why do we need to provide habitat for birds and other animals in cities? Surely they have other places to live. Obviously, it's super important for the conservation of some of our more threatened species and our biodiversity as a whole, but it's also really important for people. So we know that people who live in greener, more biodiverse neighbourhoods, especially areas that have more birds, these people tend to have improved mental well-being. So what I mean by this is they experience fewer depressive symptoms, they have less stress, and they report greater life satisfaction. So they're generally happier in their day-to-day lives. And this is something that some of you may have experienced during the COVID-19 lockdowns. It was certainly something I experienced here in Melbourne, where we were under lockdown for an enormous period of time. I found that getting outside and getting somewhere where I was close to trees and nature was really, really important for my mental health. We also know that biodiversity in cities is important for our physical health. So people who live in and who visit greener areas will come into contact with more beneficial bacteria, which is really good for both our skin and our gut health. Biodiverse streets and parks can also encourage people to get outside and exercise more, which is of course good for our cardiovascular health. And these inviting streets and parklands can also promote social connection. So they can give people a greater sense of community and give them reasons to connect more with their friends, their family, and most often their neighbours as well. So with all of that in mind, how can we actually go about improving habitat for native birds in urban areas if we want to see these kinds of benefits for both the birds and for people? This is a question that I aim to answer throughout my PhD, and I was trying to look at any kind of relationships between native bird diversity and the types of habitats that we found at different sites throughout the city of Melbourne. So, for example, in this lovely native garden here, I might have been measuring things like the extent of lawn, any shrubs that were present, mid-story vegetation. So this might be things like larger, more mature shrubs or small trees, and also our big mature canopy trees. The one other thing that I was particularly interested in was the presence of a native bird called a noisy miner. And some of you may be familiar with these birds. They're pictured here on the bottom right of my slide. They're a type of honeyeater, which is found all throughout southeastern Australia. So they do certainly belong here in Melbourne. The problem is that they can be incredibly aggressive and territorial. So there's a chance that they might influence the other birds that can occur within a particular area. So I'm going to play a short video just to show you kind of what it's like to be a small native bird that comes into contact with a noisy miner. So this video was from a TV show that was on ABC called Catalyst, and they did an episode all about urban birds, some of which was filmed here in Melbourne. So in this video, they've basically set up an experiment where they've got a taxidermied spotted pardalote, so the bird's no longer alive, and they attach it to a branch with some wire, and then next to the bird, they put a speaker, which is going to play the normal spotted pardalote calls. So as far as the noisy miner is concerned, this is a real spotted pardalote that has turned up and is now making a noise in their territory. And this is how they behave.
Here we go. They'll probably just find it in a matter of seconds now.
Oh! Oh my God. Ah.
That's the end of the pardalote.
So I know the audio isn't super great in that video clip, but basically as soon as they start playing the calls of that small little spotted pardalote, the noisy miners hear it and they come from everywhere and start attacking it, trying to get it to leave their territory. So this can be a big problem for other birds that are trying to live in the same area. So for my PhD, to try and understand what it is that our native birds might like at particular sites, I selected 30 different suburbs, which each covered an area of 100 hectares or 1 square kilometre. So I'll show you an example of one of these in just a sec. And these suburbs were chosen to try and cover a range of housing cover and canopy tree cover. So we wanted to try and get the full spread of kind of the housing density that exists throughout residential areas of Melbourne, and also a spread of tree cover that is being retained in some areas, and then also including other areas that have been fairly significantly cleared. So all these suburbs were in the north and eastern part of Melbourne, and within each of them I had 10 different sites that I would go and visit. So that's what those little clusters of dots represent on my map. In terms of the types of places I was visiting, I went to lots of different residential streets. I also visited urban parklands, areas of streamside vegetation along some of our creeks and rivers, and also patches of native bushland where they were available. Sadly, we don't have many of them left. So this is an example of one of my suburbs. Each of the yellow dots here is one of my sites that I visited to look for birds. And you'll see that most of these sites are in residential streets. So in these locations, I would have been standing on the footpath or on the nature strip. And then we also have a couple of sites here that are in some streamside vegetation along a creek line. And there's one site that is in an area of parkland. So it's mainly just cleared grass and a few scattered trees. So at each of these sites, I conducted 5 point count surveys. So that means that I would go there, I would stand at a particular location for 10 minutes, and I would write down any species of birds that I could see or hear. And I did that 5 times for each individual site. As I mentioned earlier, I was also interested in the types of habitat that were available for birds there. So things like our shrubs and our mid-story vegetation. For this particular part of my PhD, I was focusing on forest and woodland birds, but I'm just going to refer to them as native birds for simplicity, as well as, of course, our noisy miners, so those bossy, aggressive birds. And for them, I was looking at the number of surveys where they turned up. So this was kind of a way to get at how many of them there were or how frequently I was encountering them. So what did I find? Firstly, before we have a look at my results, I'll just draw your attention down to the bottom right of my screen. Anything that appears here that is a cross symbol suggests that there's a negative relationship there, or native birds are less likely to occur where we have that particular habitat present. Anything that's a tick is a positive response. So that's good for our native birds, and we want to see more of that. So the native birds throughout Melbourne showed a positive relationship with canopy tree cover. So they want to be at sites where we've got more of those big mature canopy trees, as well as the mid-story cover and shrub cover. So they're really keen on having all 3 layers of vegetation at a site. That will make them far more likely to be able to live there. They were not super keen on having exotic tree cover. So for them, it's really important that they have native trees present. And the strongest driver of whether or not I was recording a high diversity of native birds was our noisy miners. So anytime we had sites that had lots of noisy miners, or they were turning up really, really frequently, I was seeing fewer and fewer native bird species. So these guys are clearly having an impact and pushing some of those bird species out of there. In contrast, if we have a look at what the noisy miners are particularly keen on, they were also really happy to have sites with more canopy trees. And in particular, they liked sites that had really big, mature canopy trees. So we're talking, in my study area, this was mostly river red gums, which were, say, over 100 years old. They were locations that they were really keen on hanging out. They didn't like having shrubs. So if there was more shrub cover at a site, they were less likely to occur there. And they didn't like exotic trees either. So this is where things can be a little bit challenging. If we're trying to improve habitat for native birds, and something that I'm certainly seeing a lot here in Melbourne is that councils will be looking to, say, expand their urban forest or increase native tree cover throughout the municipality, which is fantastic. But if we only focus on doing that, on planting more native trees, we could be accidentally just helping out the noisy miner more. And certainly here in Melbourne, that isn't going to be a good news story for many of our native birds. If we're helping the noisy miners more, they're just going to continue to kind of spread and push other birds out of these habitats. So we want to be thinking about what else can we do besides just planting more native trees. So what do I recommend we do to improve habitat for native birds? Kind of at a very broad level, we do want to be increasing native tree cover, but I would suggest that rather than just focusing on eucalypts or gum trees, we think a bit more broadly and try to get other species of trees in there. And this is because noisy miners mainly feed in gum trees. So if we can get some more wattles, she oaks, banksias, melaleucas, just a bit of a range of other native trees, that will be beneficial. We definitely want to be adding more shrubs and mid-story vegetation wherever we can. So anything that's kind of dense and spiky is going to provide really good habitat for some of those smaller birds. It gives them somewhere to hide. It also gives them food sources. So a lot of these shrubs might be producing flowers or fruits that they're going to feed on. They could also be providing areas for insects to live, and many of our birds will also feed on insects. And finally, we want to be thinking about just trying to reduce some of those super open areas with lawn, because that doesn't really provide much in the way of habitat for our native birds. So one way that we can do that is thinking about planting out nature strips. And that's something that is getting more and more popular here in Melbourne, which is great to see, because often these areas are just lawn, maybe a street tree if you're lucky. This has been a super quick snapshot of my PhD. So if you'd like to learn more about my project or some of my work, I've actually produced an 8-page brochure that summarizes my findings and recommendations. So if you'd like a copy, you can scan the QR code, and that just takes you to a survey and asks you to put in your email address, and I can send you one. So thank you so much for having me along today. I'll just do a quick nod to my PhD supervisors, Andy Bennett and Angie Haslam, and also the generous organisations who funded my work. And thanks also again for having me along. I welcome your questions and some chat.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. That was awesome.
That we need more ground cover to encourage all those bugs so the birds can have something to nibble on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Are there things that we can do that might discourage the miners?
Yeah, so at this stage, the best thing that we can do is to try and just get rid of some of those more open habitats, because that's rarely where they thrive. So I don't think I had any pictures of it in today's talk, but a lot of the parks in Melbourne are just really, really open, massive areas of lawn and not much else. So that's great for kicking a footy around, but it doesn't do much for anything else. And it's really good foraging areas for noisy miners. So if we can reduce some of that open space, get some more shrubs in there, I think that will help to kind of reduce their numbers over time. So it's making the habitat less suitable for them. They might be less likely to nest there, and hopefully we see less of them. But yeah, it's a really tricky one.
Yeah, we have a similar kind of layouts in our parklands where we've just got heaps and heaps of lawn and then really big trees. So I guess we have kind of a similar habitat that the miners love.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned at the beginning that our suburbs are sort of forcing birds to disappear. And I guess I would like to know, like, where are they actually going to? Or are we actually pushing them more towards extinction, that they actually just don't breed anymore? And over time, we end up just with noisy miners everywhere. You know, where are they actually going, and how, obviously we want to bring them back into the suburbs, which is sort of the core of your talk.
Yeah, so I think it's probably a bit of both. I think there are going to be some that are getting just kind of restricted to any kind of, say, bushland reserves, if you have them, or around the fringes of our cities. So in these kind of lower density housing areas, there's often some areas of natural habitat, and they might just be getting restricted to those areas. They can't really find all their resources in our streets, in our gardens, so they're having to spend their lives there. But then there will definitely be other instances where they are just dying out, that they're not able to find a safe place, like those bushland areas. And unfortunately, they don't breed, and then eventually those individuals reach the end of their lives and there isn't any younger ones to replace them.
I had a question about what scale of environment is going to be effective for these birds. So the question relates to, if I've got a suburban garden that I'm planting, can I expect to be able to provide something that's actually going to be effective in supporting a native bird population?
Yeah, and that's the huge issue in cities, because there's so many different people living there, so many small patches of land that are all managed by different folks. It's really hard to try and provide everything that a population of birds is going to need in one small garden. So we really need to be seeing multiple gardens in a street, all like coming on board with some kind of wildlife friendly gardening program. Or if, say, you're lucky enough to live close to an area of bushland, or say a creek line, you might be helping to extend the available habitat. They might, you might have birds moving in from these other nearby patches, but there isn't, unfortunately, much we can expect if you're just the sole area of habitat in a massive sea of unsuitable. Yeah, that's the sad part.
Jacinta, thank you. That's really helpful. You mentioned exotic trees. So are we just talking about like palms and things like that, or what kind of trees does that refer to? And also, I wanted to know, the natives are different in different areas. So you'd have different kind of natives there than we would have here in Adelaide. And even in different parts of Adelaide, there's different kinds of natives that are local to the area. So should we be concentrating on what's local to the area, or does any kind of natives kind of fit the bill?
Yeah, really good questions, Priscilla. In terms of the exotic trees side of things, so here in Melbourne, that was made up of, it was any tree that wasn't native to Australia. So yes, there were definitely palms. There were also pines, lots of pine trees planted throughout Melbourne. Things like plane trees, English elms. So a whole range of different trees, which you may or may not have in Adelaide. But basically they're not as suitable for many of our native birds, because they don't provide the food sources that the birds are looking for. They've kind of co-evolved with a different suite of animals, either in England or Europe or wherever it is that they're from. And they also don't provide the nesting kind of habitat that some of our birds need. So we have quite a lot of birds that will nest in tree hollows. So that's like a hole that forms in the side of the tree over time. And most exotic trees don't provide that. That has to happen in a gum tree generally. So that's kind of the trade-off of having exotic trees. In terms of native, yes, absolutely, it's going to differ depending on where you are in the country. Indigenous trees are generally going to be better, so things that are locally native. But in saying that, obviously, in light of climate change, there's a lot of councils that are now thinking, well, we need climate appropriate trees. So potentially trees for Melbourne and Adelaide that are better suited to warmer climates or drier climates. So I guess just trying to keep it as locally native as you can. If it means you've got to go across the border into Victoria or WA or whatever it is, it's still going to be better than having a tree that's from England or North America.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We have a lot of plane trees and pines as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Jacinta went to this as soon as I posted my question. I think she she jumped in and said about it, but basically was just reflecting on if the little pockets of native veg are too isolated, then the populations of birds potentially get inbred. But then thinking about how there's this kind of trend to connect up, wildlife corridors and in different places around South Australia, but it's harder in urban areas.
Yeah, definitely. And it's definitely possible for some of our birds that aren't as capable as flying as far. They're the ones at risk of getting isolated, because they're not going to, say, like a cockatoo, it can fly really long distances. So it's probably able to stop and visit lots of different habitat patches throughout a city like Adelaide or Melbourne. Whereas something like a superb fairy wren, really, really tiny bird, it can't go that far in one go. So it's going to do lots of little kind of trips to move across the landscape. But if it doesn't have somewhere safe that it can stop over, then yeah, it will get stuck. So often here, at least, we see them, they move around on kind of along the creek lines, because that's where we tend to have more vegetation that's left. So that they're one way that you can have good corridors throughout urban areas, but it is really hard because you need lots of people to agree to kind of sign on to have this intact area that animals can move through.
Yeah, that's really a great question, Kerry. And I guess building on that, you know, we have the housing crisis and we've got plans by the government to build millions of homes over the next, you know, decade. What can be done to sort of put some guardrails in place to actually not make the problem any worse? You know,
yeah,
is there like a list of, is there, for every sort of new suburb that gets created, is there like a list of things that need to be sort of achieved in order to sort of stimulate, obviously, the bringing them back to the suburbs, you know? And yeah, can you speak to that?
Yeah. So like one of the big issues that we have in kind of the urban fringe developments in Melbourne is that we're seeing smaller and smaller block sizes, but bigger and bigger homes. So everyone wants this house that's more or less built fence to fence and has virtually no backyard. So we're losing a huge amount of land that may have once been kept as gardens, is now just house. And we know that provides no habitat value to, you know, 99% of our native birds. They're not going to roost on your house itself. They're going to need some kind of garden or parkland available. So I think we really need to move towards having some kind of standard across Australia where you have to keep X amount of land as garden or as something other than impervious surface. So not the house, not the paved driveway or whatever it is. And yeah, thinking strategically about where are the existing habitat patches in this area? Where are the existing creek lines? Can we connect those up in any way? So when they're at, say, the master planning stage of a new development, trying to think about where's the most logical place to put a park or a corridor, rather than just thinking about dividing it into 3,000 new subdivision lots. Go with the parkland first and then add in your houses later.
Yeah, and I suppose it's taking it just a little bit further than just, oh, you need to achieve a certain square meter and then we just infill it with grass, right? And so we're talking about like
exactly
the shrubs and actually building it up so it actually can facilitate that diverse rather than just noisy miners. Creating more space for noisy miners essentially is sort of like how I see that sort of working currently, right?
That's very much what's happening here, is that we're just creating endless kilometers of good habitat for them and slowly losing habitat for most other birds and other animals as well, not just birds.
Have you come across any like local governments or I guess community groups that have focused on creating those nature strips, like in verges, for example, or in small parks, like little corner parks and stuff like that?
Yeah, there's quite a few councils here that are really getting behind nature strip gardening. So they now encourage their residents to rip up the lawn and plant it out. Obviously, the resident has to then care for the garden. So it is a time investment and potentially a financial investment. Not everyone can do it. So far, there isn't an awful lot of research as to how nature strips help birds directly, but we know that by planting out, say, low-growing flowering plants on your nature strip is actually really good for local insect populations. So we would imagine that it's going to help some species of birds that are feeding on insects. But certainly nothing's happening at any kind of big scale as of yet. Like we're talking about a few streets here and there where they've gone out and kind of looked at how that's impacted insect populations.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because I've got a pretty big lawn at my house and I hate mowing it. So
yeah, well,
get rid of it
need to mow
a bunch of those shrubs in.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you can throw out the mower, but yeah, obviously there are some perceived barriers for people if they're not gardeners, or they're not that well, they're not educated in that space. They might be less keen.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess you could advertise it as a low maintenance garden because it's drought tolerant. You don't have to mow it. If you put them close enough, there might not be any weeds.
Yeah. They should hopefully look after themselves once they're a bit more established.
So a number of councils in South Australia have had native plant giveaways for residents to promote native planting across the council. It is a small thing that can grow into a big impact. Yeah, that's very true. I didn't know that. Maybe I should get onto my council.
Yeah, there you go. It can be a start for your own garden.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have that a bit here in Melbourne as well. So we also have something called Gardens for Wildlife Victoria. I don't know if you have an equivalent. Yeah. And they often partner with local Indigenous nurseries, and they'll do plant giveaways at different times of the year to try and encourage people to, think about their gardens a little bit differently and get more Indigenous native plants in the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from my own experience of living in a house with not, like, in quite high density suburban areas with minimal, native coverage, and then recently moved to a house that's a little bit further out, and it has sort of access to a big reserve with lots of native vegetation and a backyard that is quite diverse in its vegetation. And, you actually are able to see the birds, in the backyard. And so it's a big, it's just a big change for me personally to have that sort of difference. And then, your talk has sort of made it a little bit more obvious. So thanks for that.
Yeah, no worries. It's something that I think a lot of people don't realize, that it is really important for us to be able to see trees out our windows, or to be able to walk out our front door and have some kind of greenery rather than it just being pavement, which is unfortunately the case in many of those new housing developments in particular.
Green Adelaide here have put out, which is a kind of government urban greening agency, have put out a pretty great book, which is about, creating a native garden around your home. So they have lots of resources they share with people, and they're often doing, BioBlitz type citizen science projects, which I think are really engaging for, you get the kids in and then the adults kind of follow and learn about stuff, which is really great.
Yeah, those kind of programs can be really helpful.
My question is about water sources and about provision of water sources in a suburban garden setting.
Yeah. So water is really important, especially in the warmer months of the year. So ideally, if you want to put water out for birds, you'd want it to be elevated, so they want to feel safe. So especially in areas where you've got free roaming cats, which are often an issue, or people's dogs. You want the water elevated off the ground, and ideally close to some small shrubs, so the birds feel quite protected in coming to use that. But a really good thing to do.
Yeah, great.
You just have to make sure you keep it clean.
And the we're not really meant to try and feed native birds, are we?
Yeah, feeding birds is always a controversial one. So I don't recommend that people do feed birds, but if that's something that they want to do, and it's a way that they can kind of connect with birds in their local area, or maybe introduce a young child to nature and birds, I think it has its place. But no, you're technically not supposed to feed them. They should be finding their own food. If you do desperately want to feed them, just don't feed them bread, because that's definitely not a natural food source for them, and it can sometimes make them sick.
Yeah. Good to know.
I've just spent the weekend up the river in a caravan park, and my goodness, a lot of bread was given to the birds up there.
Yes. Yeah, there's people throwing it into the river all the time in Melbourne because they're trying to feed swans and whatnot. So, it's a nice activity, but I think maybe think about what you're feeding them.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jacinta. Really great learning more about how we can look after our birds in the burbs.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacinta. That was a really
No
good
worries.
presentation.